Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I want you to imagine a divine watchman placed right inside your chest, just silently recording your every misdeed and, just waiting for the perfect moment to testify against you.
That is a terrifying thought, honestly.
Right. But the 17th century writer Richard Sibbes, he actually called it the soul's spy, the human conscience. And today we are taking a deep dive into a specific set of sources examining Genesis 42, verses 18 through 25. And this concept of the conscience is, well, it's at the absolute center of it all.
Yeah, it really drives the entire narrative we're looking at.
Because in our modern society, we try to treat a guilty conscience like a medical anomaly. We medicate it, or we distract ourselves from it with constant noise, or we try to, therapeutically rationalize it away.
Yeah, just slap a label on it.
Spot on. We tell each other to just forgive ourselves and move on, as if we somehow have the authority to pardon our own crimes, right? But the sources we are looking at today present a very different reality. They argue that a guilty conscience is an objective theological reality before a holy God.
You cannot simply bury it. It does not work that way.
No, you really can't. And we are going to look at a historical moment where that reality just crashes down on 10 men in the most terrifying way possible.
It is a staggering contrast to how the world operates today.
Yeah.
I mean, we are conditioned to think that time heals all wounds,
Right.
including the guilt of unconfessed sin.
Sure, it happened a long time ago, so it's fine.
Yeah. Decades might pass. Your circumstances might shift entirely. You might move to a new city, build a whole new life, and you might think you have buried the memory of a severe transgression, under the floorboards of your mind.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right. But the sovereign God of Providence orchestrates events to bring those buried sins into the blazing light of his holiness. That is the theological bedrock of the passage we are analyzing today.
And we are looking at a moment that has been, 20 years in the making?
Yes, 2 decades. 10 men are standing before the Egyptian prime minister. They are terrified, they are desperate, and they are completely unaware that this harsh governor standing in front of them is the brother they betrayed.
The one they threw into a pit.
The very one. Threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery 20 years prior.
Wow. So our goal for you listening today is to analyze how God uses severe circumstances to awaken a deadened conscience. We want to look at the mechanics of how providence breaks a person's pride, to prepare them to receive a grace they did not earn.
Which is a massive paradigm shift.
It really is. But to really grasp the weight of this encounter, we need to understand the stakes. Because if we just jump straight into the dialogue between Joseph and his brothers, we miss the cosmic scale of what is actually happening here.
We miss the entire background.
Yeah. We are not just talking about a family reunion gone wrong. So can you set the historical stage for us? Why are these 10 men forced into Egypt in the first place, and what is hanging in the balance?
We have to firmly anchor this scene in its historical and redemptive setting. So we are in the patriarchal period, long before Israel became a nation at Sinai.
Right.
And right from the start, the sources are clear. We must categorically reject liberal, higher critical theories like the JEDP documentary hypothesis.
Okay, wait, let's pause there. JEEDP. For anyone listening who isn't familiar with that acronym, what is that hypothesis claiming?
Sure. So for those unfamiliar, that hypothesis essentially claims these narratives are just post-exilic myths. It argues that centuries later, different authors, and they label them Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and Priestly, which is where you get JEDP patched together various tribal legends.
So they are saying it's basically just political fiction.
Right, to justify their political relationships at the time. And the scholars who push that theory, well, they do so because they reject the possibility of predictive prophecy. Or they reject accurate, early centralized writing.
Which is wild because it totally undermines the text.
It does. But the historical data we have aligns perfectly with the biblical text. This is factual history. The events occurred precisely as recorded during the Middle Kingdom of Egypt.
Okay, so there is actual archaeological backing for this.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
The archaeological evidence regarding the Egyptian administrative state, the specific role of viziers, and the centralized grain storage, all of it validates the biblical account.
That is fascinating.
It is. So the immediate crisis driving the narrative here is a severe multi-year famine that has devastated the ancient Near East. It stretches all the way from the Fertile Crescent down through Canaan and into the Nile River Valley.
And in the ancient world, a famine of that magnitude is basically a death sentence, right?
It was an absolute existential crisis. You had mass starvation, the complete collapse of entire households, and, the extinction of bloodlines. Egypt, however, had a centralized, Nile-fed agricultural system. And under Joseph's administration, they had stored immense quantities of grain during the previous years of plenty. So Jacob is forced to send his sons down to Egypt to buy food simply to survive.
I am trying to wrap my head around the geography and the timeline here. Because if a famine hits Canaan, surely they could just migrate north, right, or find some local solution. But no, they're forced to go directly into the heart of the most powerful pagan empire on earth.
They had no other option.
And this is where the theological stakes become massive for me, because this is not just about a family running out of groceries. We're talking about the Abrahamic covenant here.
Yes, that is the core of it.
Because God made unilateral, unconditional promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Genesis 12, 15, and 17. He promised them a land, a seed, and a blessing to the nations.
Right.
And most critically, the promised seed, the Messiah, who would crush the serpent's head, going all the way back to Genesis 3.15, was prophesied to come through this specific family line.
Specifically from the tribe of Judah.
Right. So if these 70 people starve to death in the Canaanite famine, the covenant lineage dies out. The promise of a savior fails.
That is the crux of the tension right there. God is utilizing the grain storehouses of a pagan nation to execute a massive act of redemptive preservation.
It is mind-blowing when you zoom out like that.
It really is. Because if they do not get that grain, there is no tribe of Judah. There is no King David. And there is no Jesus of Nazareth.
I am thinking of an analogy to visualize this for the listener. It is like, imagine placing the only known cure for a global disease in a really fragile glass vial and then just tossing that vial directly into a hurricane.
That is a great way to picture it.
Because God is taking the fragile lineage of the Messiah and throwing it into the geopolitical chaos of a global famine. But here is the part that I find so challenging. Why would God use a pagan stronghold like Egypt?
That is the big question.
Right. This is a place famous for false gods, occultic practices, and massive military might. Why use that specific environment to protect the chosen family? It seems counterintuitive to send the holy seed into the center of idolatry.
That tension you are noticing is deliberate, and it highlights a critical aspect of how God operates. When the Hebrew brothers stand before the Egyptian vizier, the original audience would feel the terror of God's chosen people standing trial before the absolute might of the world system.
Like they are totally out of their element.
Completely. But this reveals how divine providence utilizes natural disasters and geopolitical shifts to execute divine decrees. God is absolutely sovereign over history.
Even the messy parts of history.
Especially those parts. He utilizes the sinful actions of men, the catastrophic failures of nature, and the rise of pagan empires to secure shoulders. His decreed ends, all without ever becoming the author of sin himself.
He is proving that his sovereignty extends over pharaohs, prisons, roads, markets, famines.
Right. He is never confined to the visible borders of the Promised Land. Egypt's massive administrative state, its granaries, and its wealth were all built up by God's providence specifically to act as a temporary incubator for the nation of Israel.
So the pagan empire is unwittingly financing the survival of the Messiah's bloodline.
Spot on. They are completely trapped by design.
So the geopolitical landscape has forced them into the one place they cannot escape. But the famine only gets them in the door, so to speak. It forces them into the throne room.
Yes, it is just the setup.
The other half of the equation is how the Egyptian governor, their brother Joseph in disguise, actually springs the trap once they're standing in front of him. And this brings us to the literary structure of the text, which the sources highlight as brilliant.
It is structurally fascinating. The design of Genesis is built upon the concept of Toledoth, which
Right.
translates to generations or the account of.
Okay.
So the final major section of Genesis focuses on the Toledoth of Jacob, which heavily features Joseph. And the author deliberately designs the narrative in chapter 42 to mirror chapter 37.
Oh, wow. So there is a direct parallel.
You have to look at the psychological mechanics of what is happening. 20 years earlier, in chapter 37, the brothers were fueled by murderous envy over Joseph's prophetic dreams.
Right. The dreams where they bow down to him.
Exactly, or rather, spot on. So they stripped him of his tunic, they threw him in a pit, they ignored his agonizing pleas for mercy.
Just chilling.
It is horrific.
Yeah.
They callously sat down to eat a meal while he suffered, and then they sold him to foreign traders for pieces of silver. Now fast forward to chapter 42. They are physically bowing down to him, their faces to the earth.
They are fulfilling the very dreams they violently tried to stop.
Yes.
The irony is just staggering. Man's rebellion is the specific instrument God uses to establish his will. They tried to destroy the dream, and their attempt to destroy it was the very vehicle that brought it to pass.
It is divine judo, in a way.
That's a great phrase for it. But when Joseph recognizes them, he does not just, drop the disguise, reveal himself, and
Yeah.
throw a feast.
No, not at all.
He acts harshly. He accuses them of espionage, claiming they are spies looking for the vulnerabilities of the land. And then he throws them all into an Egyptian prison for 3 days. To a casual reader, this looks like petty vengeance.
It does look like that, doesn't it?
Yeah. He has the upper hand, he has the power of life and death, and he is making them sweat.
It looks like vengeance on the surface, but the sources clarify it is the exact opposite. Joseph is not acting out of a petty desire for payback.
So what is he doing?
He is meticulously reconstructing the precise environment of their original sin. He is plunging them into the same helpless, terrifying vulnerability that they forced upon him 20 years ago.
Wow.
He literally places them in a pit, the Egyptian prison, just as they placed him in a pit in Dothan. It's a carefully calibrated test.
He needs to know who they are now.
Right. He needs to know what kind of men they are. Have they changed? Will they still sell out a brother to save their own skin?
It feels like a perfectly designed escape room, where the only way out is absolute honesty. They are trapped in a physical and psychological pressure cooker.
And they have zero leverage.
None. They have no money that means anything to this governor, they have no diplomatic leverage, and they are entirely at his mercy. And after 3 days in that literal pit, Joseph issues a chilling command that pivots the entire narrative.
Let's look at what actually happens in verse 18.
Yeah, lead us through that.
The first major movement of the text begins with Joseph giving them terms. He comes to them on the third day and says, "Do this and live, for I fear God." He demands that one brother remain bound in the prison while the rest take grain back to their starving households in Canaan. But they must return with their youngest brother, Benjamin, to verify their story and prove they are not spies.
That phrase, "I fear God," is so striking in this setting. Like, just think about a massive Egyptian ruler making a theological statement like that to a bunch of nomadic shepherds.
It is the theological hinge of the entire scene. And the Hebrew syntax here is crucial to grasp.
Oh, I love the syntax stuff. Unpack that for us.
The phrase in Hebrew is et Elohim ani yader. In normal Hebrew narrative prose, the verb typically comes first.
Okay.
But here, the direct object, the true God, is placed emphatically at the front of the sentence.
So he is putting a massive spotlight on who it is he fears.
Yes, Joseph is not just saying, "I am a religious guy." He is declaring, "It is the God whom I fear." He uses the absolute term Elohim.
Wow.
In an ancient context where Egyptian pharaohs claimed deity for themselves and attributed their might to pagan gods like Ra or Osiris, this statement would strike the Hebrew brothers like lightning.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Let's think about this from the brother's perspective for a second.
Sure.
If a foreign absolute dictator suddenly tells me, "Don't worry, I fear God," that does not immediately make me trust him.
That makes sense.
Right. Historically, dictators claiming divine mandate is terrifying. It usually sounds like a justification for holy war or unchecked tyranny. Why on earth would this statement comfort the brothers or make him more trustworthy in their eyes?
That is a fair point. But here is the difference. Authority unhinged from divine accountability always becomes tyranny. You were right that people have abused divine claims, but in this specific context, the fear of God means reverent submission to a holy standard.
Okay, so it is a restraint on his power.
Precisely. Joseph's power in Egypt is massive, but his authority is restrained by reverence. His justice is tethered to a holy standard, not to the whims of a pharaoh or his own personal vindictiveness.
So he's basically saying, I am not going to act like a typical tyrant.
Right. The fear of God teaches a man that he is never ultimate, even when others are entirely under his command. He is telling them, "I answer to a higher court."
And that completely shifts the dynamic for the brothers.
It does. When Joseph says he fears God, the brothers realize they are no longer dealing with earthly diplomacy. They cannot use bribery. They cannot manipulate him with smooth talking.
They are suddenly dealing with the court of heaven.
Yes. The absolute, unbending standard of divine justice has just entered the room.
That realization that they are dealing with divine justice acts as a massive psychological break for them. It shatters their defenses. And this leads directly into the next verses, where the narrative shifts from this external political dialogue into a highly private internal conversation among the brothers.
It is a phenomenal shift in the text.
And you listening to this right now, you might have something you buried a decade ago. You think because your circumstances changed, the debt is canceled. But look at how Providence works here.
Yes, in verses 21 and 22, The fortress of their hardened hearts finally shatters. They say to one another, "Truly we are guilty concerning our brother."
Notice how they bypass the immediate false accusation of espionage completely.
They do not even address it among themselves.
Yeah.
They do not say, "This is so unfair, we are not spies." Instead, they zero in on their true historical guilt.
They directly link their current suffering in an Egyptian prison to their cruelty toward Joseph 20 years ago. The outward distress performed an inward surgery.
That is a great way to frame it. And the lexical analysis the sources provide for this confession is fascinating, because it is not just a casual apology.
No, it is not a modern, "I'm sorry you felt hurt by my actions" kind of non-apology.
Not at all. The confession begins with the Hebrew particle abal, which is a word of sudden, forceful realization.
Like a light bulb going off.
More like a sudden blow.
Mm.
It is like saying, "Alas," or "truly." It marks the total collapse of their self-deception. The illusion is gone.
Wow.
Then they use the root word asham for guilt. Now, this is critical. In the Levitical system, asham is a technical term for incurring a debt of guilt that requires a specific trespass offering.
So this is legal terminology.
Yes, they are not just feeling sad or regretful. They are acknowledging objective legal culpability before God. They are stating, "We owe a massive moral debt."
They realize they owe a debt, and they get incredibly specific about what they did. They do not hide behind vague generalities.
They recall the Zara, the deep anguish and distress of Joseph's soul.
Anguish?
Yes. They remember his pleading, using the word hitchaneno, which denotes intense, repeated begging for grace.
So they literally heard him begging over and over.
For 20 years, they have tried to silence the echo of that begging in their minds. They ignored his distress then, and now distress has found them.
It is the law of retaliation, right? The lex talionis.
Precisely. The punishment fits the crime. Reuben then adds to the terror by saying, "Now comes the reckoning for his blood." He uses the word darash, which means to demand an accounting or an investigation.
Darash. Wow.
In biblical law, God is the one who requires blood. Reuben is realizing the supreme judge has opened the books, read the charges, and is now demanding payment.
Think about a time you tried to bury a mistake. I mean, you can pile years of normal life on top of it. You can build a career, have a family, and create a whole new identity.
You can convince yourself it never happened.
Right. But the conscience is an internal witness that refuses to stay buried. When the pressure hits, that buried thing comes rushing to the surface. It is such a sharp contrast to modern therapeutic excuse-making.
Absolutely. True conviction names the specific sin honestly. It does not blame society or emotional conditioning or family dynamics.
No, it says, "I am legally culpable. I heard the begging. I ignored the distress, and now the reckoning is here."
That honesty, that painful extraction of the truth, is spot on what Providence was orchestrating. God used the famine, the journey across the desert, the false accusation of being spies, and the dark, terrifying prison to create a mirror.
A mirror they could not look away from.
Right. The text is showing us the anatomy of an awakened conscience. God has cornered them so completely that they have nowhere left to look but inward.
Now, here is where the tension hits a breaking point. The brothers think they're having a private moment of despair.
They think they're totally alone in this.
Yeah. They are speaking to each other in Hebrew, pouring out their guilt, assuming this Egyptian ruler has no idea what they're saying. They think they are safe in their native tongue.
But he understands every single word. Verse 23 provides a crucial explanation that resolves the dramatic irony for the reader. An interpreter, a militz, stood between them.
Wait, so they had a translator this whole time?
Yes, an official court translator. Joseph had intentionally used an intermediary to keep up the charade. The brothers assumed their secrets were safe. But the hidden past is not hidden at all.
Because Joseph is standing right there.
Yes. And Joseph's knowledge mirrors the greater truth that God hears all confessions, all excuses, and all concealed conversations. Every whispered admission of guilt reaches the throne.
And Joseph's reaction to hearing this confession is deeply emotional. The text says he turned away and wept. It is such a sudden shift from the harsh, commanding governor to a broken-hearted brother.
The Hebrew grammar here paints a vivid picture. The author uses a wa consecutive verb, wayip.
Wayip. What does it mean for the structure?
For the listener who does not read Hebrew, think of this grammatical form acting almost like a cinematic cut in a movie. It sequences the action in a tight, unbroken chain.
So it's immediate.
Yes. The confession happens, and immediately, logically flowing from that confession, is the weeping. And this is not a silent, stoic tear rolling down his cheek.
No.
No. The word wayipik denotes audible sobbing. The man holding the authority of life and death over the known world has to turn his face to the wall to hide the violent breaking of his own heart.
That is heavy. But here's my question, though. If he loves them enough to audibly sob over their confession, why doesn't he just drop the act right then and there?
It is a valid question.
I mean, why not reveal his identity, tell them they are forgiven, and throw a feast? It seems almost cruel to hear them confess, weep in secret, and then turn back around and keep up the terrifying facade.
Because reconciliation without truth is shallow. This is the paradox of severe discipline paired with weeping compassion.
Okay, unpack that paradox for us.
Joseph is wounding them in order to heal them. Let's look at the psychology of the brothers. Yes, they confess their guilt regarding Joseph. But there's another brother,
Benjamin,
the other son of Rachel, the new favorite.
Oh, right. The dynamic is still there.
Exactly. If Joseph reveals himself before they fully face their guilt and prove how they will treat Benjamin, the family rot remains.
So the core issue wouldn't actually be resolved.
Right. He has to test whether they will sacrifice Benjamin the way they sacrificed him to save their own skins. His severity is an instrument of mercy, meticulously calibrated to produce genuine, lasting repentance.
So love is not always softness.
No. The wound of conviction is painful, but it is cleaner than the infection of hidden sin.
That is a phenomenal point. The wound is cleaner than the infection. So after weeping in secret, Joseph washes his face, suppresses his emotions, returns, and binds Simeon right before their eyes.
He just locks him up right in front of them.
Simeon is taken as a hostage, further ratcheting up the pressure. He is the collateral to ensure they bring Benjamin back. But then Joseph issues an order to his servants that is utterly baffling.
It really is a massive pivot.
It is a complete pivot from the harshness we just witnessed. What does verse 25 tell us?
Verse 25 outlines a stunning display of sovereign provision. Joseph commands his servants to do three distinct things.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, fill their receptacles with grain. Second, secretly return every man's money into his sack. The word used is yulehashiv, to cause to return or restore.
Hashiv, okay.
And third, give them provisions, etc., for the road back to Canaan.
It almost feels like trying to buy a house with Monopoly money, right?
Monopoly money.
Yeah, like you walk in, hand over your fake cash, expecting to be laughed out of the room. But the owner not only gives you the house for free, he also fully stocks your fridge for the next year.
That analogy is spot on. The brothers were trying to buy their physical salvation with silver. And let's not miss the irony here.
The silver.
It is the same currency they used to sell Joseph into slavery 20 years prior. They're trying to purchase life with the currency of betrayal.
Oh, man, the currency of betrayal. And Joseph completely rejects their attempt to pay.
He will not accept their silver.
The symbolism there is immense.
It is. Joseph refuses their payment because the bread of life cannot be purchased. It must be received as a gift.
Notice the verbs in this verse. Fill, return, give.
Yes, they denote unilateral, unprompted action by the ruler. The brothers are entirely passive recipients in this transaction.
They contributed nothing.
Absolutely nothing to their physical rescue except the sin that made them desperate and the empty sacks that needed filling.
It is a pure display of unmerited grace. And what is so fascinating is that this grace precedes their full understanding of what is even happening.
Right, they do not understand it at all yet.
They leave Egypt terrified. When they open their sacks on the road and find their money, they do not rejoice. They panic.
They think God is punishing them further.
Yes, setting them up for a theft charge. They do not yet realize it is an act of overwhelming kindness.
Precisely. This mechanical breakdown of Genesis 42 reveals a blueprint for how God interacts with humanity on a grander scale.
It really does.
It moves through a specific sequence, from the absolute demand of the law to the crushing conviction of the conscience, to the free, unmerited provision of the gospel.
That brings us to the final analytical section our sources provide. The writers step back to look at this entire narrative through a Christological lens.
Which is vital to understanding the book of Genesis.
But we need to be careful here, right? We are strictly avoiding arbitrary allegory.
Yes, very strictly.
We are not saying, like, every sack of grain represents a specific Bible verse or every piece of silver represents a specific sin. That gets ridiculous.
It does, and it distracts from the actual text.
But we are leaning into clear biblical typology, looking at how the structural patterns of the Old Testament point forward.
Right. Joseph stands as one of the most extensive types of Jesus in the entire Old Testament. The parallels are not accidental. They're designed by the sovereign architect of history.
Walk us through those parallels.
Look at the pattern established in the text. Joseph is the beloved son of the Father. He is rejected by his own brethren. He is stripped of his garments. He is sold for pieces of silver. He descends into the pit of suffering. He is falsely accused.
The similarities are undeniable.
And then he is exalted to the right hand of supreme authority, becoming the sole dispenser of the bread of life to a starving world. The brothers have to go to the very one they pierced in order to find salvation.
And the theological dynamic between the brothers and Joseph maps perfectly onto the dynamic between the law and the gospel.
It is a perfect map. When Joseph acts harshly, accuses them of being spies, and demands Benjamin, he is functioning like the law.
Because the law brings the knowledge of sin.
Yes. It is a harsh taskmaster that shuts every mouth, strips away every excuse, and brings the sinner to the end of himself. The law does not save, it exposes the guilt.
But then comes the gospel.
Right. When Joseph weeks in secret, fills their sacks with grain, and returns their silver, he is functioning as the gospel. It is the free, unearned imputation of righteousness and life.
Because the brothers could not merit their salvation.
No, it was provided freely by the mediator.
I want to make this very practical for you listening right now. If God uses severe circumstances to wake us up, how do we interpret our own hardships?
That is the big practical takeaway.
How do we avoid falling into the trap of thinking every flat tire, every financial loss, or every illness is a direct punishment for a specific sin we committed? It is easy to look at the brothers and say, well, they deserved it, but how does this apply to the everyday believer facing a famine of their own?
That is a crucial distinction to make. The sources reference the Puritan writer John Flavel, who spoke beautifully about tracing the rainbow through the rain.
Tracing the rainbow through the rain, I like that.
We must not fall into the error of Job's friends, assuming every affliction corresponds to a specific personal sin. That is bad theology.
Right. It turns God into some kind of karma machine.
Exactly. Or rather, yes, it does. For the believer, hardships are not punitive blows from an angry deity demanding payment. The payment has already been made.
So what are they?
Rather, hardships are fatherly chastening. God uses the immense pressures of life to purge remaining corruption, to test and strengthen faith, and to draw the person closer to the table of grace.
So the goal is restoration, not destruction.
Always. Even when Providence seems to speak roughly, even when the circumstances feel like a harsh Egyptian governor, the heart of God is weeping with compassion toward his elect. The goal of conviction is never endless despair. It is always restored fellowship.
So we have covered massive ground today. We looked at the inescapable reality of the conscience, that internal spy that refuses to be silenced by time or distance.
We really dug into how Providence uses our environment to corner us.
Yeah, we examined the righteous standard of a holy God who will not allow hidden sin to remain hidden, but orchestrates the entire geopolitical landscape to bring us to the end of ourselves.
And we saw the shocking, unearned provision of a weeping mediator.
A mediator who fills our empty sacks with the bread of life when we have absolutely nothing left to offer. We saw how true conviction requires naming the sin honestly, recognizing that grace cannot be bought with our filthy currency.
The monopoly money, as you called it.
Right, the monopoly money. Before we wrap up this deep dive on Reformed thinking, I want to leave you with a specific, lingering concept to investigate on your own.
Something for them to mull over.
Yes. Consider the present distress or the famine in your own life right now. Look at the pressure points. What if the circumstances making you feel completely trapped, terrified, and helpless are not signs of God's absence?
That is a staggering thought.
What if they are not signs of his hatred? What if they are the highly specific, severe mercy of a hidden brother, breaking your pride so you have no choice but to accept his free grain?
I love that.
Think about that. Thank you for joining us, and keep seeking truth in the sources.